Good.
So thank you so much
Okay, got
for
it.
joining us today for this crucial conversation. We are very honored to have you with us on modern diplomacy. So my first question, the theme of this interview is debt justice and the international financial architecture's reform, as you know. So you were present at Geneva for the UNCTAD 16 last week. So my first question is on the theme of UNCTAD 16, which was inequality and convergence. So do you think like tackling the debt crisis can be a strategy for achieving debt justice, or like rather than allowing it to widen the inequality gap?
Well, it's definitely important, I mean, especially for heavily indebted countries, for the poorest countries, of course, to address the debt problems. I mean, the main impact on them is that it squeezes fiscal space. I mean, it constrains their ability, government's ability to finance public services,
Hmm.
to finance development, and this actually increases inequality in two dimensions. I mean, on the one hand, on national level, because I mean, the state's intervention in the area of social protection, in the area of financing education, health is, of course, important
Yeah,
to address inequality of national level, but it also widens the inequality between poorer and richer countries because, at least when it comes to developing countries and low and lower middle income countries, creditors are usually external creditors. So most of the debt service goes to creditors abroad.
yeah,
And of course, this makes richer countries rich countries richer and poor countries poorer, so to speak.
yeah. So my second question is on the reform of the IFA. So the current international financial like structure, is usually called neo-colonial in regards to its impact on the global South countries. Do you agree with this characterization, and why?
Well, if neo-colonial is the right term, I would not. There's definitely an imbalance in the governance structure. I mean, it depends on the institution. When you look at IMF and World Bank, for instance, I mean, they are $1, one vote institutions. That means richer countries have a larger voting share. And actually,
Yeah,
these two institutions are very much dominated by the USA, which
yeah,
has which has veto right in both institutions. So there's clearly an imbalance here between richer countries and poorer countries. Actually, even when you look at the quotas, it's even, I mean, it hasn't been updated for a long time. So in
mm,
fact, I mean, countries like China should have larger voting rights
yeah,
there. And then you have many institutions which have a very limited membership, like the OECD, the Financial Stability Board, and so on, which do many important things in terms of financial regulation. And but there's no seat for, at least for the smaller developing countries, for least developed countries, or for small island development states in these bodies at all. So they are bodies with limited membership, but they actually make rules which have global reach, which have universal values. So this is yeah, well, I mean, if you want to call this new colonial, but it's the imbalance. I mean, there's definitely an imbalance in the governance. Yeah.
I think the reason why it's called new colonial is because it's been like the IMF and World Bank were formed after World War II, and then they were formed for the Western countries, but their programs are now implemented in the global South, and that
Yeah.
pushes the global South countries, and it widens the inequality gap and that distress in those countries at that time, like in the recent times. So you were mentioning about the imbalance just now. Do you think, I mean, following the discussions in Geneva and in general, do you think there's any actionable proposal to reform the IFA? Any proposal that has a real chance of moving forward?
Well, I mean, governance reform is a very big issue for a long time. Governance reform of IMF and World Bank. This
Yeah,
would go through the quota reform, but at the moment, the main challenge is that when you redistribute quotas and voting rights at the World Bank or the IMF, the share of the USA would fall below the 15% threshold, and this is the one with the veto right. So it will basically, it's almost impossible to get the US administration's approval for that. Same as the Europeans. The Europeans are overrepresented, but I think they would be willing to give up a few percentage point here and there or so because it's not such a big difference. But this avenue is a little bit blocked. I mean, a tiny step, an incremental step that has been taken recently was to add a third African chair to the executive board of the IMF, so
yeah,
that you have another African voice. But these are incremental steps. So that's indeed the question. I mean, many regions are reacting blockage of reform at IMF and World Bank by setting up regional institutions, for instance. I mean, China has been very strong in setting up new development banks, or the Africa is now trying to set up an African stability mechanism, which would have pretty much the same functions as the IMF, but on a regional level, so they can control it better. So these are a little bit alternatives. Yeah. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, it's tough job to do these governance reforms at the old institutions. So I mean, a third way is basically what we are advocating for a lot, is to simply transfer mandates away from the IMF and the World Bank to the United Nations, where you, of course, have a complete different governance structure, because there you have one state, one vote.
Yeah.
That means you have a much stronger role for the Global South in the United Nations institutions.
So you're saying that what you're proposing here is to move away the mandate of World Bank and IMF to the United Nations. Don't you think the countries of the global north also dominate the UN? And it's not very different.
Well, it depends. I mean, when it comes to the voting in General Assembly, I mean, theoretically, the G77, which is the group of the developing and emerging economies, always has a majority. So theoretically they can vote any. I mean, the G77 can pass any resolution at the UN General Assembly with majority vote. But then these resolutions are non-binding. I mean, this is one of the reasons why the UN has little power and few mandates, because I mean, you could say that the distribution of power in the United Nations doesn't really reflect the distribution of power in the real world. So that's a bit of an issue. And then, of course, one channel how richer countries exercise influence on the United Nations through the funding. I mean, just a small share of the UN budget is the so-called assessed contribution, so core budget, which the UN can use. I mean, basically based on a democratic mandate that comes from the General Assembly. The lion's share is basically earmarked funding, and here basically who pays decides what happens. Basically, that is indeed a channel to exercise influence. Yes.
So you were mentioning alternatives right now. So many countries in the global South and Asia Pacific are now going towards regional monetary funds like ADB and all, and South-South Triangular Cooperation. Do you think that these alternatives offer a viable path, or do you think they create new dependencies?
Both. I mean, on the one hand, of course, it increases choice. I mean, for countries that need external financing, it is a good development that they're no longer dependent on the so-called old donors, the member states of the OECD, but that there are now alternatives for funding. I mean, China is, of course, a very prominent one, but also the Gulf states, or even India and other countries.
Yeah.
But yeah, on the other hand, of course, it does also create new dependencies. I mean, these South-South cooperation donors, partners, of course, there's a different set of values. I mean, it's all based on this Bandung principle spirit of respecting sovereignty. But of course, I mean, each country has their interests, of course.
Yeah, I mean,
it does create new dependencies as well. Yeah.
So now I want to talk about a little bit on the sovereign debt. So in your opinion, what does an equitable sovereign debt restructuring look like? One that does not put the heaviest burdens on the citizens of the indebted nations and countries.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's about the procedure. I mean, you would need to have something like an independent decision-making mechanism, which is not the case at the moment. I mean, well, you can compare this with a corporate insolvency case. I mean, in a corporate insolvency, you have an insolvency court, and the insolvency court is an independent act that makes a decision. We don't have this mechanism, such a mechanism in state insolvencies, or when it comes to sovereign debt. Basically, an indebted country has to negotiate with the creditors, which are very dispersed. I mean, it starts with the World Bank to the bilateral creditors to bondholders and banks. And of course, I mean, the debtor stands with the back to the wall, because of course, they're in a financially very difficult situation, politically very weak and economically weak. So it's a quite power imbalance here.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, the procedural is one thing. The second is the criteria that you use for deciding how debt restructuring works. I mean, how much debt needs to be canceled or restructured. And I mean, most countries, when you look at insolvency law on national level, the basic needs of the people are protected. For instance, I mean, in a private insolvency, in most countries, you cannot take the person's bed or something. I mean, something they really need to live.
Yeah.
This is not the case in the state insolvency. Basically, there is no. I mean, what we are advocating for, debt justice advocates are advocating for, is to protect basic human rights and needs, basically.
Absolutely.
So to say, a state needs to have the capacity, the financial capacity to fulfill its human rights obligation towards citizens, and this money cannot be touched by creditors. So
Yeah.
this would be a criteria to decide how much debt needs to be restructured or relieved in a debt restructuring process.
But you just mentioned in the start about the shrinking of the public space whenever these bailout packages or austerity measures are being implemented in these countries. So don't you think like a large part of the GDP is being allocated to debt servicing, then the economy does not have enough space to then spend on public goods, such as the human rights in general, like education and health and so on and so forth. Then how would a developing country, then maneuver debt servicing and then spending on public goods?
Well, I mean, this is the dilemma that we currently have, basically. I mean,
Yeah,
in fact, the developing country cannot really maneuver. I mean, in fact, I mean, we have the situation that many countries, as we say, default on their development because they do not default on their debts. That means
exactly.
they actually allocate large shares or too large shares of their revenue to debt service, which means they lack the funding for education, health, whatever,
Yeah.
infrastructure. Yeah, that is indeed a dilemma. This is why we are advocating for reform, yes.
So there's a thing called Bridgetown Initiative, which says to use the IMF special drawing rights for climate finance. Um, do you think that we are still treating the symptoms and not the root cause of debt injustice if we do use the special drawing rights of IMF for climate finance?
Well, I mean, yes or no. I mean, the special drawing rights are, especially in times of crisis, they are a cheap source of liquidity for countries,
Yeah,
and this makes I mean this makes sense. I mean, as such, they are a useful tool, which is why many countries in the global south advocated for a new allocation of special drawing rights, or even I mean, the Bridgetown Initiative actually in the first version they asked for a regular allocation of special drawing rights, like every year a certain amount,
yeah,
which would almost be like if a global central bank creates money out of thin air to finance a global public good like mitigating climate change. And I think this is not a bad idea. Then, of course, I mean, the debt crisis has many, many reasons, some of which are indeed, I mean, have a certain cultural legacy, like the division of labor between developing and industrialized nations. I mean, which means that they're running trade deficits, the problems to raise public revenue in many countries, which means they cannot finance their budget without borrowing, and so on and so
yeah.
forth. So there are many, many various reasons for the debt crisis, and yeah, special drawing rights do not address all of them. That is clear. Yeah.
So talking about climate finance, we know that climate finance is mainly delivered through loans, mostly. But the problem with that is that it then pushes the vulnerable countries even deeper into their debt cycles and traps. How can we move towards grants and climate reparations to break this destructive cycle so that every country then can work on its climate targets?
Yeah. I mean, it's indeed a scandal. I find that richer, wealthier countries, especially those with a polluter
Yeah,
background,
yeah,
do not contribute sufficient climate
yeah,
funds as grants. I mean, at the moment, it's very much. I mean, despite the fact that the Paris Treaty and the UN's Climate Convention have a certain legal status, it is a voluntary source of spending, basically. So,
mm,
and you basically cannot, as far as I currently see it, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I'm more an economist, but you cannot really legally enforce climate finance, or you cannot force a country to allocate. So this is why it's sort. I mean, it depends on, I mean, on goodwill, or also on convincing governments of richer countries basically to make this money available. I mean, which is lots of NGO campaigning of the climate justice movement is about, basically.
yes,
I mean, if there's ever, yeah, I mean, there are, of course, I mean, there are ideas to have a more legally binding way of contributing funds, not just for climate, but also for
mm,
development. I mean,
yes,
we discussed for a long time that donor countries should also have laws that make that make them comply with the zero point 0.7 target, because this never, I mean, with a few exceptions, this never happened either. So
yeah,
it is a bit highly problematic. And of course, in a situation like this, where we also in the north, you have many countries imposing austerity, using austerity policies, it becomes very competitive to allocate
Yes.
spending. So that's a difficult situation. Yeah. Let's see what Belém is going to bring.
Hmm.
It's again on the agenda, of course, and climate fund. But yeah, for now, it's a voluntary source of spending or
So the
voluntary. Yeah.
next part is me asking you to enlighten me anything that happened at UNCTAD about the ODA. Did ODA come on the panel in discussions, or what is the current status of ODA discussions right now happening?
Not so much at the UNCTAD conference. UNCTAD is very much, of course, it's the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, so they
Yeah,
have a strong focus on trade, and they do have a debt and development finance branch where they mostly talk about debt. So ODA never played such a big role at the UNCTAD conference. Then on the other hand, at the same time, the OECD Development Assistance Committee just started a review process
okay,
because the situation is at the moment very dire when it comes to ODA.
absolutely.
For this year, we expect a drop of about 17%, and this doesn't even count that basically much of this ODA is inflated aid anyway. So it's like
Yeah,
spent on refugees or it's spent on admin costs and on hosting foreign students in donor countries. It's not really transferred to the global south. So
exactly.
so the ODA, the aid regime is in a difficult state, and it's known. It's felt by recipient countries, of course, because many feel the impact. Let's take the collapse of the USAID, which has led to a massive shortage of funding in health
Yes.
systems in many countries. And also in donor countries, they know that, that the figures are not looking so good. So yeah, the system is in a difficult state at the moment.
So if you could implement one structural change at the IMF and World Bank tomorrow to advance debt justice, what would it look like?
Yeah, I think the I mean, one, on an operational basis, I think the absence of a debt restructuring mechanism is the most problematic one. You would need a debt restructure, let's say a state insolvency regime that basically has the two features that I mentioned earlier, which is to have an independent decision-making body and which have rules for debt restructuring that protect the basic needs and human rights of the people in affected countries. I think this is one gaping hole in the international financial architecture, and this should be filled.
Hmm.
There's a big discussion if such a mechanism should be attached to the IMF or not.
Yeah.
And obviously, due to the governance structure of the IMF, so many debt justice activists don't think it is a good idea to give the IMF more power in a further institution, but rather create an independent insolvency regime, or perhaps attach it to the United Nations. But I think this is the most important innovation. Yes.
So you were mentioning about the civil society just now, and that they advocate for debt justice. So for the social movements and activists in global South, developing countries, and all over the world who are advocating for debt justice, where should they focus their energy for the greatest impact? That's my last question to you, by the way.
My experience is that you need to do both. I think one of the effective campaigns on debt issues was, of course, the Jubilee campaign in the late 1990s.
Hmm.
And I think the reason why it worked is because you had very skilled, also technically skilled people doing advocacy on governments, on international institutions, but you also had a mass movement protesting in the street. And I think
Okay.
this combination is effective. If you have only one of those, I think it's not, you need this multi-level strategy if you want to achieve access, because I mean, I think if you just have a mass movement, basically, the energy just sometimes disappears because it's not very focused on a certain policy target. On the other hand, if you just have technical geeks doing advocacy on
Yeah.
international organizations, the people at the international organization feel that they're not being backed up by people in the street, basically. So I think you need the combination of both, basically. The street, the mobilizations in the streets and the advocacy on the global level.
That sounds amazing. So that brings me to the end of my questions. If you have any concluding remarks, the floor is yours and the audience is yours.
Well, these issues are on the agenda for a long time now. Basically, I've been working on them for more than 20 years, so I hope we make some progress in taking these reforms forward. The situation for many countries and for many people in heavily indebted countries is indeed Daria, I mean, at UNCTAD, again, the figure feature that now 3.4 billion people live in
Yes,
countries whose governments spend more on debt service or just on interest payments, not on debt service in general, just interest payments and on health and education. So if you, I mean, we have the saying now that debt kills the SDGs, so to speak. I mean,
absolutely,
that basically
absolutely.
that's,
Yeah.
and so I mean, it would be urgent to make some progress on the reforms that we're advocating for.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I've had an amazing conversation with you. It was short, but it was very incisive. I learned a lot of things from you. So thank you, a big thank you for taking out time for modern diplomacy in your very busy schedule.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.